Sherry Niles is an art appreciation podcast presented through the examination of individual episodes of the 1990s TV sitcom Frasier. Let's get snobby.
So hi, I'm Catherine Mayo.
And I'm Doug Winter, and welcome to the Sherry Niles podcast. This is episode 1 of our first podcast.
So Doug, tell me a little bit about why you wanted to make this podcast.
I guess it's because I started watching Frasier through a streaming service, and I watched it every day. And then I realized when I got to the end of the entire sitcom that I started it all over again, and that I could just watch it over and over and over again. And through watching it repeatedly, I started being curious about the phrases and the objects and the antiques that Frasier surrounded his life with.
Yeah, it's interesting because you started telling me about those things. The objects and the art and the operas.
Yeah, it was, I became a little obsessive. And I guess I still am. I really enjoy the writing. I love the characters of the show. The music is somewhat soothing. Of course, his voice, most of the voices on the show are very soothing to listen to. And it's very dependable and consistent.
I think that's important, when you're wanting to go for some comfort entertainment, to have something that's dependable and predictable, reliable.
And the interesting thing about it is, about the Frasier TV sitcom, is that even though it's the same, in each episode there are things that I noticed. And I think the reason that I started watching it over and over again is that the second time around in watching it, I noticed some of the things in his apartment. He speaks about Coco Chanel's couch that she, is a reproduction from her atelier. It became kind of bigger than just a TV sitcom in the sense that I kind of suffer from insomnia. So while watching the show, I started to list the things that I had no knowledge of, or very little knowledge of, that I wanted to see the depth of the writing on the show and the historical references that they make to certain movements of art, or Frasier's moods, or certain shows he speaks more in French than he does in other shows. And so what I started doing is, while watching the show, I would pause and then look up that phrase or object on the internet and do some reading, kind of do a deep dive, and then continue with the show. And the show became even more funny doing that than before. And now I can laugh at certain things that people don't think are very funny, but because I'm such a Frasier-phile, I think they're really hilarious.
Well, and I think it's important to note that you have a background in the arts and that you are a conceptual artist.
Yes, I do have a background in the arts, and I am currently a conceptual artist. And so art objects, music, literature, these things are of great importance to me, as they are to Frasier, although I don't subscribe to loving opera or, certain authors that he reads, I now will read, but it's a very interesting parallel in the sense that I don't think that I would name drop Wassily.
Well, and I think it's interesting too, because one of the things that you've told me is that he name drops or he references things and he's not always correct.
No. Frasier he's kind of a Poindexter in the sense that most of what he says is correct. Like, most of everything he references is correct, but the writers put in a little point in which he's off. So, for instance, in season 3, episode 1 of She's the Boss, there's a new program manager of the radio station KACL, Kate Costas, played by Mercedes Ruehl, is talking to Frasier about how to improve his radio show. And he says, can we really improve my show, Kate? Can we? And they go back and forth, and he said, I would really like to open the show with some classical music. And she said, well, that's kind of highbrow for most people. She said, personally, I love classical music. And he says, I was thinking about Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra in D minor. Kate replies, the concerto is in C, Frasier. And he said, no, I believe it is in D. And she said, no, I worked at a classical station, and every time he recorded it, it was in C. And so there's this back and forth. And when he reluctantly has to, which he really doesn't, say that he's wrong. And he rarely does say that he's wrong.
So in this first episode, he mentions Lalique Glass.
Right. In the very beginnings of this first episode, he talks about Lalique. And the first episode of Frasier, the reason I think it kind of hooked me in, and just with all similar TV sitcoms that have a lot of staying power, is that usually that first episode is so dense with a foundation for character development that they can spring off in any direction. So in the first episode of Frasier, not only are they talking about Lalique Glass, but he gives a little tour of his apartment at the Elliott Bay Towers, in which he's like, well, there's a chair by Eames, the Coco Chanel's couch, Wassily chair, and he kind of name drops all these things. And so it's so dense with those art objects and other references about his father, Martin, liking beer and pork rinds, and how those two opposites, really it's hard to believe that he's actually Frasier's father, but we'll talk more about that later. Also, the show is a lot about theory, and it could even be into some type of Frasier conspiracy theory. We can talk about that too. I have a lot of some crazy ideas about the characters, what they did after the show, where they are now, what they might be doing while they're not on the show. So we'll take a deep dive into that as well. But in the first episode, Frasier has just moved from Boston to Seattle, and he is away from his ex-wife, everything he knows, his son, Frederick. And he is insecure about everything. Everything's so new to him. He's new to the radio game. He's kind of bumbles a little bit with the knobs and the microphone and the headphones. And then after the first show, he goes into the producer's office, Roz Doyle, and he says, so what do you think? How do you think the show went? And she said, your brother called. And he said, oh, okay, well, and then he pushes, and she pushes back and says, did I ever tell you what this button does? And he says, Roz, in the business we call that avoidance, because he's a psychologist, now radio psychologist. And Niles, his brother, calls him a Mick psychologist, or a popcologist, really. He said, look, I'm not as fragile as a piece of Lalique. I can take it. And then she just goes on to list everything he did wrong, dropped 3 calls, scrambled the call letters, left 28 seconds of dead air, and spilled yogurt on the control board. And Frasier says, you say my brother called, which is pretty funny. But with that, I really didn't understand what he said, so I paused it. This is probably the 3rd or 4th time around that I'd watched the entire sitcom in its entirety. I looked up Lalique. I did an internet search and looked up Lalique, and came to discover just this incredible powerhouse of an artist and an industrialist, and his story and his art and what he created and left us that we can still enjoy, because you can go on eBay right now and buy a piece of Lalique glass and even a piece of jewelry that he made. It's really beautiful, and it really can encapsulate the spirit, the creativity and love that artists make their mark on our world, which, to me, that's one of the reasons I create work, is not only for myself and to kind of deal with what I'm going through and how I interact with the world around me through making art, but to leave an indelible mark for someone to discover. And in the same way that he left that indelible mark to discover, oddly enough, through a TV sitcom in the 1990s, Frasier, I found this amazing artist. And René Lalique was born in France, lived from 1860 to 1945, which was just an incredible time for a person to live, because he lived through World War I. He died 3 days after World War II ended, so he got to see the end of World War II, and the reign of terror of Hitler left, and he knew that his precious Paris and France were going to be safe and free from the Nazi regime that we all so hated. Think about what he lived through from 1860 to 1945 was the modern movement in art. I mean, he went from, very stylized, realistic drawing and painting to Jackson Pollock, action painting, dribbling, art onto canvas.
I mean, if you think about our discipline, which is photography, he's born not too long after photography was invented.
That's correct.
To see it established as a medium, and then to see it take shape into all these different forms, and then to merge into the modernist movement. There's a lot that happens during that time, and all of that seemed to have been infused in the work that he created. And one of the things that was interesting that you told me about was that within this reference, Frasier makes about Lalique being fragile, that he's not as fragile as a piece of Lalique, you actually found that Lalique glass is inherently pretty strong.
Yeah, that's correct. Glass is fragile. If you drop it, there's a possibility it could break. But Lalique glass is so dense, and it looks so delicate and rugged at the same time. It's hard to believe that even if it dropped, it would break. It would probably chip. And, Lalique really loved to use non-traditional materials like bone and ivory and tortoiseshell. All those things, you think of bone and ivory and tortoiseshell and animals and how rugged and tough those animals are. They're not fragile at all. And Frasier name-dropping Lalique as being fragile, one, Roz doesn't know what Lalique is. Certain people do when they watch it. Frasier tries to separate himself and place himself above others constantly. And that's why I really enjoy the show, is because he's constantly trying to one-up someone about either, by name-dropping Lalique or talking about his Eames chair. His dad, Martin Crane, has no idea who Charles and Ray Eames are. These powerhouse couple, that really changed the direction of furniture design and architectural design, and were inspirations to thousands and thousands of people. Martin Crane doesn't know that. He knows about the Seattle Seahawks and Ballantine beer and pork rinds. And Martin Crane also knows about working really hard and providing a really good home for his son Niles and Frasier to become snobby jackasses.
Which I think is what we see persisting throughout the whole series, is that balance between the two of them, the brothers and the father.
Correct. I don't think that Martin Crane is their biological father, and that's addressed. that is somewhat addressed in one of the shows later on, and I think it's the 10th season. But I have a big conspiracy theory about who fathered Niles and Frasier Crane. But we'll get to that later on in the podcast series.
So besides Lalique, what are some of the other things that Frasier mentions within this first episode? Because it's pretty dense with some references, isn't it?
It's very dense. The references that Frasier mentions are the Eames chair, the Wasili chair, Coco Chanel's couch, and he also mentions the fact that his father is moving in to live with Frasier, Martin Crane. Martin has fallen down and spent more than 24 hours face down on the tile floor in his apartment. And embarrassingly, they either have to put him into a home or move him in with Frasier. So when Martin comes over, he's pretty salty about the fact that he has to live with his son. Doesn't like it. He sits down on the couch and he looks around, and as Frasier says, he says, well, nothing goes together, Frasier. What's going on? And he goes, well, the chair by Eames, this chair by Wasili, you're sitting on Coco Chanel reproduction couch that she had in her atelier. I mean, it's called eclectic. And what you do is you start with one really good piece, a very, kind of expensive piece of furniture. And if you put them all together, it goes. And he says, well, it's your money.
So what are some of the things that you saw, some themes that you see running through Lalique's work?
Lalique really enjoyed walking in nature when he was a young man. And at the age of 12, he left home to pursue a career in art. And I think about that, which is, pretty incredible for someone at the age of 12 to begin a career in art. But some of the things that run through Lalique's work are a lot of flora, fauna. The female form, the nude female form was, really at the apex of his creations. It runs through almost everything that you see. But he enjoyed dragonflies, night butterflies, which are moths, sparrows, leaves, and just really ordinary objects. And he was really taken with dandelions and would make brooches of dandelions. And you think about a dandelion, it's a weed, but in the hands of René Lalique, it's a piece of art. They are the most beautiful brooches you'll ever see of a weed that anybody has ever created. I mean, in fact, he started to create glass, not in his kitchen, but in a small area. They believe, probably it's not very difficult to create glass objects. You can do that in your apartment if you want to. And he, on one of the dandelions, which is really beautiful, he created this very delicate domed piece of glass to go over the top of it to symbolize the delicacy of it. And they are just incredibly beautiful. And he used very, very strange, unconventional objects to create to create his jewelry, which I talked about before. But he loved rock crystal, which is just crystals, that they're not valuable really, and horn and ivory. He experimented with aluminum and steel, which is not a precious metal. Don't get me wrong, he used 24 karat gold in a lot of his jewelry, 18 karat gold in a lot of his jewelry. But the stones, even though some of them are diamonds, a lot of these objects look so expensive, but it's kind of like going back to the dandelion that's a weed. It didn't matter what he made the jewelry out of, horn, tortoiseshell, whatever, in his hands, in his creations, it looked like $1 million. It looked like the most incredible piece of jewelry you've ever seen. Delicate, translucent, refracted and reflected light. It almost looks like that there's light emanating from inside the object. And you can tell that he put a piece of himself in each piece of jewelry or glass that he created. He created perfume bottles for Coty. Like I said, he started the Art Nouveau movement because of where he sold his work. But I will say this, he did treat the glass and the other objects with a frosted finish. And that really allowed these objects to glow. Almost like they had a soul. They're really, I've never seen a piece of Lalique in person. I've only looked them up and watched videos on the internet. But I can't even imagine what it would be like to hold one of them in my hand or wear one or have one in our home.
So, Doug, in this first episode of Frasier, there's tons of things that are referenced, right?
That's correct. It is dense with name dropping and object references.
So you're planning on doing a deep dive into all the references in that first episode and then follow through with the other episodes, right?
That's correct. It's not going to be so much of a academic deep dive that people get bored with what we're talking about. Really, what I want people to do is, if they're interested, like today we talked about Lalique, just go maybe to your library or the internet and look up Lalique and read about this incredible man, this incredible industrialist. But we're going to be talking about Ray and Charles Eames because he has an Eames chair. We're going to talk about Wassily and Marcel Breuer, who created the Wassily chair, and he and Kandinsky were not really roommates. They were kind of roommates, but they're very good friends. And so Kandinsky loved that chair so much that Wassily made him one, a Model B3. And we're going to talk about Coco Chanel's couch.
It sounds like fun. I think this is going to be really fun.
It's going to be great. If you love art objects, and snobbery, this is the place for you.